Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with the group about some of the work that we've been doing in Maine. So basically what I'm going to do here, just following along the models of some of the previous presentations this semester. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of our overall uh, tick-borne disease situation in Maine, some of the things that make like Maine a little bit different from the other New England states. And then I'm going to mostly be focusing on our research, uh, our prior work and our plans moving ahead related to the NUVEC project. So I'm just going to give kind of a brief overview of several different projects that my group's been working on, and then hopefully there's going to be a lot of time at the end for feedback. Part of our goal here is to get your all take on our plans prior to the beginning of the summer field season, which we're very deep into planning now. So I'm presenting today on behalf of myself and my two colleagues, Alyssa Bowman, who's a research associate and a PhD student in my lab, and Mike Galley, who's a full-time research assistant, and he's going to be entering our master's in entomology program in fall 2024. So what I'm talking about here is really work that's been very collaborative between the three of us. And indeed, Alyssa and Mike have been managing a lot of the day-to-day of these projects. And so I know at least Alyssa's on the call, and I might call on her to step in if there's any questions or clarifications needed during Q&A. All right, so I want to start off just by introducing our team. So this is our group of people who have been involved in the NUVEC project to date, our team from last summer. So again, I'm Gardner. I've already met most of you. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maine, a medical entomologist in the School of Biology and Ecology. And then the other key people who are involved in the project, once more, are Alyssa, who's the project manager for the EDGE project in Maine. We've been working together for the past 5 years. Mike, who's a research assistant, again, an incoming master's student. He's the one who's been leading the fieldwork related to EDGE for our lab. And then I also want to acknowledge at the start the undergraduate students who have participated in EDGE so far to date. Savannah Deere, Chloe Hart, Juliana Lepanto, Donnie Sinderson, and Sophie Whiting. This is the gang here. They were the ones who were collecting all of the data that I'm going to talk about last summer. All right, so I want to start off again by talking a little bit about what's different about Maine compared to some of the other New England states. As this is a collaborative regional project that we're working on, I think it's important just, for everyone to get an idea of the different sorts of ecological and sociocultural situations in the different states. I've lived in a number of the states in the Northeast at various points throughout my childhood and my adult life. And when I came to Maine, I noticed a lot of, very distinct differences, simply as a member of the community and also as someone, doing research on a mix of private and public land. So I want to start off just by highlighting a few of those differences. First, residential property in Maine, and this is going to be relevant to EDGE later on, looks very different from the suburbs that you see in a lot of states like New York and Connecticut and Rhode Island, for example. So this is a picture of one of our EDGE properties from last year. You can see we're not dealing with the situation of having, like a really small, like really manicured lawn that you see in a lot of suburban areas, like where I grew up in New York. Instead, we have, much larger lot sizes in general for most of the properties that we were working on. The landscaping is a little different. The way that the homes abut the woods is a little bit different. And I mean, this is just one example of a property. They take on many different flavors, but it's not really, when you think about the landscape that we're working on, it's not quite the same situation that you might be envisioning in your home state. Certainly very different from any place where I've lived previously. Another difference is that there's a very high proportion of private forest land ownership. So this is a map here of non-industrial private forest land ownership in the state. And you can see that especially down in southern and coastal Maine, which also happens to be the region that's like most severely affected by Lyme disease, over 80% of the land is privately owned. So we've got a very, interesting land use context going on here, where a lot of the decisions about how the forest is managed, including vector control, is being made by private landowners rather than by public entities. But that being said, there also is a very high prevalence of outdoor recreation on public land in Maine, perhaps to a greater extent than in some of the other states in the Northeast. So one of the things that I started thinking about when I moved here and I started working on tick-borne disease here about 8 years ago is that this region, this state really seems to challenge a lot of assumptions that are made in southern New England, for instance, that the main place where people are encountering ticks is on their private property. Here we have a very high degree of private access to public land and public access to private land for that matter. And so I haven't been totally convinced. I think this is an avenue for future research as well. But I haven't been totally convinced that the main place where people are encountering ticks necessarily is around the home in the state, given that people access their neighbors' properties and public land with great regularity. And so the implication of this is that a large portion of our research, which I'm going to talk about as I move through the slides, is focused not only on private land, but also on public land, because we think that this is one of the places where people are really encountering ticks in the course of recreation, hunting, hiking, so on and so forth. And then finally, and this is something that I'm not going to be able to back up with citations, but it's just something that I've observed in my interactions with landowners. The last thing I want to highlight that's a bit different about Maine is the environmental values. There really is a very strong prevalence of environmental values in the state. I've noticed that there's a lot more resistance, especially as you get further north and perhaps a little further east as you get further away from the coast. Notice that there's a lot more general resistance, like using insecticides, for instance. There's a lot more interest in finding IPM strategies broadly posed that are complementary to people's other, aims for how they want to manage the environment. And so as we think about how to control ticks in Maine, this is really the context in which we're thinking. We're thinking about how to devise management strategies that are going to be aligned with private landowners' values and socially acceptable. Because I think that we've seen play out in many states all over the country that, we can have all the best scientific ideas in the world about how to manage ticks, but if people aren't implementing these ideas in an effective way, there's not really a whole lot of value to this. We need to find practices to recommend to landowners that are going to be aligned with what they're willing to do. So this is just a little context about Maine. Now from here, I want to introduce our goals for NUVEC in Maine. So these are the main projects that we're working on over the entire lifetime of this grant. Some of these projects are well underway. Some of them are just getting started. I'll give you the very broad overview of what we're trying to accomplish in the state. So first, obviously the key goal for all of the COEs, we're conducting applied research to manage black-legged ticks as our principal research focus. And this falls into a few different veins. First, the project that we've been working on, concentrating much of our effort on to date, is the Itch project in Maine. So to date, this has been encompassed mainly a residential tick survey, which I'll talk about as I move through the slides, and many of us already are familiar with. And then this summer, we're also going to be adding an insecticide evaluation component to Itch as well. So I'll talk about that. Our second project, which we're just getting started this field season, deals with the impact of invasive buckthorn management on ticks. And I will describe our long-term plan for this project over the next 3 years in more detail as I move through the slides. Third, we're working on a project dealing with the short-term impact of timber harvesting on ticks. And so this was a project that actually started prior to NUVEC getting off the ground. But it is complementary to the aims for the COEs, the applied research goals. And so we've continued to support data collection for this project under the NUVEC grant. And then finally, this last project is the one many of you know that I'm on sabbatical this year. And I am conducting a research project as part of that, dealing with residents' willingness to pay for tick control on public land. That project isn't actually being supported by the NUVEC grants at all. but I do think that it's complementary to the NUPEC goals. And I'm going to focus on these first three projects today. I'm not going to talk about the fourth project at all, just because, I'm going to keep the focus here on the field work and the things that are being supported by the grant per se. But I will put out there now that if there's any interest among the group to hear more about that fourth project and what I've been working on more in a social science and epidemiological vein during the sabbatical, this is something I'd really be happy to talk about with this group in the future. And I'm trying to, develop a project there that I think is relevant and complementary to what we're trying to accomplish as a team. Again, going back to our broader goals for NUPEC in Maine, of course, the research is just one arm of what we're trying to accomplish. We're also trying to provide training and research for graduate and undergraduate students. And I'm anticipating that over the lifetime of the project, 3 graduate students and 20 undergrads are going to be engaged. And then we're also trying to provide classroom instruction for students. And so this is really taking on 2 different veins in which we're bringing NUPEC data into the classroom. First, I'm trying to incorporate analysis of data collected through NUPEC into existing courses. So as part of my teaching appointment, I teach a general entomology course, and I also teach a course on emerging infectious disease that approaches the topic from both ecological and social science perspectives. And then I also am going to be, at some point over the next few years, developing a kind of one-off medical and veterinary entomology graduate seminar. It's hopefully going to provide more medical entomology training for our students at UMaine, since we don't have a medical entomology course here at this point. So now I'm going to go ahead and talk about each of these projects in turn. I'm going to start off with ITCH, which has really been our focus here so far on the grant. So here's the timeline of how ITCH is going to work, how it's already started in Maine, and what we're planning to do in the future. We've got a number of different goals for ITCH. Our first goal, which we completed last summer, was to characterize tick densities on residential properties that are not being treated for ticks. So the goal here was to gather some baseline data for subsequent studies that are going to focus more on interventions. To our knowledge, this is the first residential tick survey that's been conducted in Maine. And so we were lucky to be able to adapt some of the methods that Nita and Tom already have developed for the context of our state. Our second goal is to identify predictors of tick densities on residential properties using a combination of field collected data and remote sensing data. And so here we collected the data in 2023, and we'll be working on the analysis over the next academic year with our new master's student. Our big project that we're planning for this summer, which I'll talk about in more depth, is we're conducting a field experiment to test the efficacy of acaricides to reduce tick densities on private land. And so the product that we're going to be using is beta-cyfluthrin. The label is Tempo SC Ultra. And I will talk more about kind of how this project is going to roll out as I move through the slides. And then in 2025, in the future, one of our next goals is to conduct tests of the persistence of chemicals that are used for tick control in the residential environment, like in well water or soil or dust inside the home. This is part of a collaboration that Mike has orchestrated with the Maine Board of Pesticide Control, where he was employed prior to rejoining our lab within the past year. And we're also going to conduct in the future additional survey research to try to understand how residents, homeowners, weigh the benefits of tick control versus the persistence of chemicals in deciding how to manage ticks on their properties. And the broader context of this, again, is in the interest of devising tick control strategies that people are really going to use in practice. Because right now we're thinking about this largely in the context of PFAS, which is a really hot button issue in the state, probably in many states throughout the region. So we're trying to understand, how do people weigh the potential threats associated with PFAS versus the threats that are associated with ticks? How does this all stack up in the balance when people are actually making decisions about how to control ticks around the home? So this is the broad overview of what we're working on. Now to go over a quick overview of what we did in 2013. In 2013, we focused the study in Penobscot County on 40 residential properties. These are highlighted in blue here. All of the properties, people volunteered through the H1 survey to participate in this study. We selected a subset of properties from those volunteers that met our various parameters that we wanted all the properties to have. So all the properties that we used for the study had a wooded edge somewhere on the property, and all of the parcel sizes were greater than 3/4 of an acre. This was because this actually turned out to be a very representative property size in the state. We wanted to ensure that we'd have sufficient forest available to drag. And then our other requirement for 2023 was that none of the properties could conduct any sort of residential tick control. The property owners, we asked them to self-identify whether they conduct tick controls. So if you used any terricides, you're out. If you use any bait boxes, you're out. If you've got deer fencing, you're out. No efforts to manage ticks on their properties. Again, this is all in the interest of establishing what are the baseline residential tick densities in a state where no prior survey of that sort had been conducted. We did the tick collections at 3 time points in June and July. So 3 time points by 40 properties. We had 120 sampling days in total. And as many of us did for our surveys last year, we collected ticks in 3 zones per property. So zone A was the forest edge, nearest to the home. Zone B was 1 to 2 meters inside the forest, just past the edge. And then zone C was the forest interior. And the reason why we were interested in that zone C is because even though people aren't, regularly accessing that area of their property, just wandering around outside their house, we thought it was of value because a lot of property owners in Maine do use their own woods for recreation. And so they would routinely find themselves a little bit deeper into the woods. And so even though this isn't a place where it would be logistically feasible to apply any sort of acaricides or any sort of tick management, in all probability, we were interested in individual exposure risk when people are using that part of their property for recreational purposes. And then, like everyone else, we adapted NIDA's protocol. We conducted 15 minutes of flag sampling per zone per time point. So this wound up being quite a bit of flagging time by our 6 students who are working on this project last summer. We also did some vegetation data collection, again, in the interest of our second aim of trying to identify some correlates of tick densities on these properties that were untreated for ticks. And so we have a forest measurement protocol that we've used in a number of prior studies that was developed in collaboration with one of our silviculturists at the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station here. And so this protocol encompasses measuring overstory vegetation, like basal area, trees per acre, tree species composition, and canopy closure. We also measure understory vegetation. So here we're looking at things like leaf litter depth, understory density, invasive plant composition and density. And again, all of this is geared toward, understanding what habitat looks like for ticks. We selected these particular features to measure because we thought that they might be correlated to tick densities from our prior work. And then we also noted additional property features such as log piles and rock walls and gardens, anywhere else where people, might be exposed to ticks. So here's a brief overview of our data that we collected in 2023. These data are very raw, just to give you an idea of what's going on. Mike is going to be analyzing these data in much greater depth as part of his master's program over the next academic year. And I showed these data when we had the meeting in January as well, the planning meeting. So you've seen these before, but for those who weren't in attendance at that meeting, this is our overview. In 2023, we collected over 200 adult ticks and over 1,200 nymphal black-legged ticks, so really high tick densities. You can see the number of ticks in the graph. We calculated the number of black-legged tick nymphs per hour with all of the time points combined. So you can see that there's quite a bit of variability in the tick densities across the different properties that we're interested in exploring the reasons why as we get a deeper dive into the data. We also collected 180 adult dog ticks, 2 adult and 94 nymphal rabbit ticks as well. All these ticks at this point are with guang getting analyzed for pathogens. And so this is basically what we got. We also saw that there were very distinct differences in the tick densities in zone A, which again is the edge, versus zones B and C, which are, immediately within the forest and deeper into the forest. looks like this zone BC area is really where we're seeing the largest number of ticks compared to directly on the edge, which is kind of interesting to know for the purpose of insecticide applications. All right. Let's move on to 2024. So in 2024, we're planning to make a few changes to our fieldwork plan. First, we're going to be expanding the number of properties. So this year, we're going to be visiting 60 residential properties in Penobscot County as opposed to only 40. So we'll be continuing to visit the same sites as last year in blue. And we also have added new sites this year, which are shown in yellow on the map. We're also going to be conducting our experiment, which Andrew and Johanna have been taking us through the IACUC process. Thanks so much for your help with that. We're dividing the properties into two groups, a treatment group and a control group. In our control group, we're going to treat them the same as last year, no tick control treatments on 30 of our properties. In the treatment group, we're going to be spraying insecticides on those properties, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And all of the properties are going to be sampled for ticks, following the same schedule and the same protocol as last year. So we'll be able to build on last year's data as part of this study. As far as our insecticide spraying goes, we've had a lot of debate over things like what product to use and when to conduct the spraying. And we really want to thank Tom for his inputs into this and his expertise. The product that we ultimately settled on for this is Tempo SC Ultra, which again is beta-cyfluthrin as the active ingredient. We're going to be spraying it using a backpack sprayer. And the reason why we eventually converged on this product as opposed to using bifenthrin is because we have it from our colleagues at the Maine Board of Pesticide Control that bifenthrin is likely to be delisted very soon. It's likely to be banned in the state because of the PFAS issue. And so the Board of Pesticide Control folks thought that when bifenthrin is banned, this is the product that's currently available. People can just buy off the shelf, and they think that this is what people are most likely to turn to immediately when they lose access to bifenthrin. And so in the interest of, again, doing a project that's going to serve the needs of people in the state, we decided to focus our testing on this product that is likely to become the default option within the next couple of years for homeowners who are looking to do tick control on their land. And so we're spraying using a backpack sprayer. We're going to spray at 2 time points, one in late May and one in mid-July. And again, you bear in mind that in Maine, our tick season is a little bit different than in southern New England. We hit our peak of black-legged tick nymphs in early July, typically. So our study time points are going to be in late June and early July, or early to mid-July. I guess August is the absolute latest that this could run. And we're going to be doing the spraying ourselves. We were not able to find any pesticide company to collaborate with, up this far north. But fortunately, we have a lot of relevant expertise within our own lab group. Alyssa already has a master applicator license, and so now she's certified for doing this residential tick spraying as well. Mike is in the process of getting his applicator license to work underneath Alyssa. And so we consider this like a nice virtue of the experimental design. We're going to have a very high degree of control over how the spraying is done, the schedule on which it's done, which is hopefully going to, make for a good experiment this summer. Okay, so those were our plans for itch. I would, however you'd prefer to do this, I'd be happy to take questions now or at the end after I've gone through the other projects. Do you, Steve, have a preference for how we run this? I can't really see anything that's going on in the chat because I've only got one screen here.
Hey, Ali, this is Lars. If you don't mind a question right now, I was just wondering what part of the properties will be sprayed?
Yes. So we are going to be spraying in the zones A and B. So it's all going to be within 2 meters of the forest edge. And the reason we're doing that is because that seems to be consistent with the CDC recommendations. We're not going to be spraying the lawns as this just doesn't seem terribly effective, and it's not what we're expecting people to encounter ticks anyway.
I was just asking because we have we want to reduce the amount of spraying, but we do have the studies, the tick net studies showing that the the spraying only along the edges didn't cut it in terms of reducing human tick bites. So it's more a matter
Yeah,
of, the sprayed area versus the human activity space on the properties. If they,
yeah,
how often people don't stop at the edge
yes,
and just move
yeah,
farther into, it's just, I'd be good to maybe work with people on the properties to understand how they use the properties as part of the evaluations.
yeah. So sorry, so you're cutting out a little bit here, which I'm not sure is if it's on your end or my end, but I believe that I'm catching the gist of this and I'm taking notes. Yes, so I agree. I've seen the studies that show that spraying on the edges is not going to butter the biscuit when it comes to reducing the tick bites. I think, it seems like that's going to be a very difficult problem to disentangle because it also is, those studies were also kind of predicated on the assumption that the home really is the main place where people are encountering ticks and getting bitten. Um, but yeah, what we're going to try to do for this study is go a little bit deeper into the woods, not just the edge, a little bit deeper into that zone B as well, which seem to be like the place where the highest tick densities are occurring. And we do know that people go into that part of the woods on a routine basis, like with their pets or whatever. So we're gonna give this a shot, see if it does reduce tick densities at the very least with this product, if not tick bites. But I agree that that understanding where people are actually getting bitten by ticks and how they're interacting with their properties in more detail, which I know is something that Andrew's working on, is going to be of value if the goal is to evaluate the response variable of the number of tick bites rather than the tick density per se. Thanks for the question. I see Andrew raising hand as well.
Yeah, so no, I mean, there's a big issue around insecticide, acaricide use, and the lobster fishery.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any sense for how cyfluthrin may be better or worse or same, or if there's is there any kind of proactive messaging about trying to deal with that challenge to treatments?
Yeah, so if Alyssa's on the call, I'd like to put you on the spot briefly, if you don't mind. Are you familiar with this product as related to the lobster? Because I am not. This is certainly something I can take notes on and think about more.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't remember. I remember when we first looked at the label, we thought it was gonna work for our area. I mean, it is, you're not supposed to spray it anywhere near water, like water sources, river streams like that. So we're definitely not planning on using it on any of the properties that like back up to a river, something like that. So hopefully, because we're not coastal and we're not going to be spraying near any waterways that run into the coast, it won't have a huge impact. But I mean, that's a good point because you're right, people are very aware of those issues. And so I can go back and look at the label as well and see what it says about that, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
I think all along there's never been strong data that it impacts the fishery, but there's this public perception that it does, and it seems like if that's going to be a continual barrier to kind of residential treatments in Maine, then I don't know. Anyway, that's a whole separate research agenda. Just
and I agree, Andrew. I think that to your point, the perceptions matter just as much in the reality as many cases. And I do see that, this is where the need for social science research comes into play. And I do see this as a future avenue that I personally am interested in for our lab that I think will be of value to this group as we think about how to actually develop strategies that people are willing to implement. How do we deal with that perception? To what extent does that perception have merit? So I agree, but again, I also feel that is a totally different research avenue and research program, but one that is of great interest. Yeah, I'll take one more question, and then I'll move on. Tawny?
Thank you. I thought I'd unmute. I had put something in the chat just oh, and Alyssa's answering. So I was wondering if you, because we're familiar with Mainly Grass as a big company that takes a lot of our UMass trainings on occasion, and and I know they do tick and mosquito management, but looking like they don't work as far north as you would need was the issue.
Exactly. Yeah, they tend to work in southern and coastal Maine. They work in York County, and Tom's introduced me to those folks, which is great. But it just it didn't seem feasible for for our particular situation this summer.
Sure. And then just as an aside, I looked up the national NPIC, what is it? National Pesticide Information Center. I'm not seeing much mention for aquatics, but wanted to comment that I would think folks would be really nervous about pollinator impacts. I don't know if any of your collaborators mentioned concerns about that.
Yeah, so I mean, we haven't been focused on this kind of risk perception research to date. Again, this is actually something I'm getting a little bit more in my my project that I'm working on my sabbatical that I'm not talking about today. But I do think that all of these issues, like these environmental questions, are all going to come into play. Our goal for Itch at this point is to evaluate: do we think that this product is going to work at all at reducing tick densities that people are grabbing off the shelves when bifenthrin is pulled? And then the next logical research avenue that I see, I hope that there's going to be an NIH grant out of it at some point. It's going to deal more with these issues of what are the barriers to people actually adopting practices that we have an inclination are going to work based on the biophysical research.
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. So I'm going to move on with the slides just in the interest of talking about plants, but I'm happy to continue fielding questions. And if anyone has suggestions around study design, of course, I welcome that as well. We're in the stage right now where we're very heavily into planning, but we haven't finalized anything yet. So this is a great time to be getting feedback. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some discussion around the invasive plants, which is our next project. Boy, this was a terribly made slide. But our next big project that we're starting this year is dealing with invasive buckthorn and ticks. And so just to give a feel for the motivation for this study, like we already know that numerous studies, especially conducted by our colleagues down at the Connecticut Ag Station, have established strong links between invasive plants and vector-borne disease. A lot of that work has been done in the barberry system, which is not really a major concern in Maine. Like once you get up, we do have barberry, like not to trivialize the barberry situation here, but that's more focused in southern and coastal Maine. As you get further north, buckthorn is really one of our big invasive species of concern. There's been no prior work concerning buckthorn in particular, although interestingly, there has been a fair amount of social science work around people's motivations and willingness to manage buckthorn. So that's kind of interesting to note. But as well, on a more practical level, many questions do remain despite decades of research on ticks and invasive plants to help bring invasive plant management more into practice as a vector control solution. So for example, like we don't really have a very good idea at this point of what area of infestation, density of infestation by invasive plants is needed to actually affect ticks. Like to take this to like a logical extreme, if you've got like one plant on a property, chances are that's not going to have any impact on ticks at all. But we can imagine that at a certain point, we're going to hit a threshold area of infestation that's going to be really meaningful and worthy of control in the context of tick-borne disease specifically. Another question that's open is about like spillover effects. So like say that, we've got this huge invasive plant infestation and we're just we have the resources to manage a piece of it, which is a situation that land trusts really encounter on a very frequent basis. So what is the effect of managing on that smaller area of land on the entire area? Like if you've got really high tick densities associated with the invasive plant, you clear the invasive plant on a 20 by 20 meter plot. I mean, that's all we have the money to do in 1 year. What's going to happen? Are the ticks all just going to move next door to the areas that haven't been managed? Or are we going to see an area-wide decline in tick densities as a result of managing a smaller area within a larger infestation? We also can ask ourselves things like, is there a difference between the impact of chemical versus mechanical removal of invasive plants on the tick densities? Mechanical removal is a lot more popular. We know from the social science research, people don't like the idea of chemicals on their land, but chemicals, of course, are much more effective at actually removing invasive plants. Does this, combination of treatments, this balance of what kind of treatments you're doing, actually impact ticks when we're thinking about invasive plants in the tick context specifically? Okay, so we've got a lot of questions, some of which we're going to have the budget to answer on NUVEC and some of which we're not. Bill and I already have been applying for other grants together to work on this question and to try to raise more money to answer more of these questions. but I'm going to go over what we're going to attempt to do within the context of the NUVEC project, using the NUVEC grant essentially as like the seed funding to support studies that hopefully will become larger in the long term. So this is the overall design for the study. This is a study that's going to take place over 3 summers. We're going to, in summer 2023, we're collecting baseline data to establish the relationship between ticks and buckthorn. We're going to be doing this on a bunch of different plots. Winter 2023, we're not doing any kind of management. Summer 2024, we're going to go back and we're going to collect ticks on the same plots and also in the area immediately surrounding the plots. And I'll go through some pictures of what this looks like in a moment as well. Then what we're going to do, so we're doing this on control plots that are native vegetation, and then 2 sets of plots that are infested with buckthorn. Then what we're going to do is in winter 2024-25, we are going to remove the buckthorn on this 3rd set of plots that are eventually going to become these so-called managed plots. And then in summer 2025, we're again in our control plots that are native plants, our control plots that are buckthorn infested, and our managed plots, we're going to collect ticks within and immediately surrounding the plots. And then this is what's going to give us our indication of whether this management is affecting tick densities both within the plots and in the area surrounding the plots. So we're testing for the spillover effect of invasive plant management here. So again, this is a planned 3-year study. It's going to be conducted in a block design with 5 locations. The locations are the blocks. Within each block, we're going to have each of these treatments represented: the control plots, the buckthorn plots, and the managed plots. So 3 plots are going to exist within each of these 5 locations. The 5 locations are going to be spaced apart from each other such that we can consider them to be spatially independent. All of the plots across all 3 treatment groups are going to be 20 by 20 meters in size. We're going to conduct tick collections within each plot, along the edge of the plot, and then again within the 30-meter buffer surrounding each plot. And the goal is to eventually be able to test for these spillover effects of invasive plant removal on tick densities in the surrounding areas where management has yet to take place. And the way that we're going to understand the effect of buckthorn removal on ticks at each of these different spatial units is by analyzing the interaction between the year of the study and the treatment. We're looking for a significant 2-factor interaction that's going to indicate that there is an effect of managing the buckthorn on the tick densities. So right now, an important stage that we're in, and a large part of the reason I'm in Maine for these 2 weeks is that Alyssa and Mike and I are working on field site identification for this buckthorn study that we're starting this summer. So this is just, for example, to the left, you see what a control location might look like. And on the right, you see what a buckthorn infestation looks like. So this is very dramatic. We're going to be spending a lot of time, obviously, refining the flagging protocol that's going to let us get in there because it is extremely dense. And then again, for our plans for 2024, again, the main goal is to collect baseline data for this eventual study of the spillover effects of invasive plant removal on tick densities, and also to establish this association between ticks and buckthorn. We'll be collecting ticks on the 3 plots for each of the 5 blocks, including both the infested plots and the control plots. Collections will take place, like for itch, at 3 time points in late June to July. And we are going to be doing collections using the same time flag sampling technique, similar to the technique, excuse me, that we're using for itch. All right. And then the last project that I want to take us through, this will just take 5 more minutes. And then I'll have time for questions related to everything related to invasive plants and vegetation management. Oh my gosh, I think I'm allergic to something in my office. So timber harvesting and ticks, our lab has for a number of years now, really since 2017 or 2018, been studying the impacts of timber harvesting on black-legged tick densities. And the reason why we're so interested in timber harvesting in particular is because this is like a very understudied area of forest management in relation to ticks. And yet it's a very important type of forest management in Maine. A lot of private landowners, excuse me, on their own land conduct timber harvests, either because they're trying to get firewood for themselves, or because they're trying to make a little profit on their land, or because they're trying to manage their land for wildlife in some fashion. And so a lot of people do timber harvesting on their private land. There's a lot of timber harvesting on public land for similar reasons as well. And yet there's been a relatively thin record of work relating timber harvesting to ticks compared to, say, the invasive plants and ticks literature, or the prescribed burns and tick literature. And historically, the focus of our lab and the few other studies and other groups that have addressed this topic has been on the impact of timber harvest on ticks between 5 and 10 years after a harvest took place. But we conducted a really large citizen science study in 2020 and 2021 that Alyssa led, where we trained private forest landowners to collect ticks on their own properties, conduct some forest measurements, and then we look for associations between forest management and ticks. And the citizen science study indicated that the effect of timber harvesting on ticks may really change over time. And so restricting our studies to this narrow window between 5 and 10 years post-harvest might be a really overly simplified look at the impacts of timber harvesting on tick ecology. And so we initiated a few years ago this collaboration with Bry Mountain Recreation Area, which is public land managed by the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And Alyssa and Mike have been managing this study for the past few years to understand the short-term impacts of timber harvesting and ticks. And our goal is to sustain this as a long-term study where, over the course of hopefully my long career at the University of Maine, we'll be able to get a very good understanding of the long-term impacts of timber harvest on tick densities and infection prevalence. And so this is a layout of the study. We have 3 areas that we've been working on Fry Mountain. We've got some control plots with no planned harvest in the near future that we're using as baseline data. Then we have an area that they ultimately did patch cuts, which are like these small cuts in the middle of the woods. And then we have a big area where a clear cut took place, just an enormous number of trees, all the trees being taken down at once. And so we're interested in what are the effects of these smaller patch cuts and the clear cuts on tick densities over time. And so our study design, we started in 2021, pre-NUVAC, sampling 4 plots in each of these eventual treatment groups. The patches were harvested in winter 2021. And so we've now done 2 years of sampling in the plots, both within and immediately surrounding the harvest, again, looking for these spillover effects. The clear cut area was harvested in winter 2023. So next year is going to be the first year post-harvest that we're sampling there. But basically, we've got this study layout where we're sampling for ticks before these harvests took place, after these harvests took place for multiple years after the harvest, and then we've got these control plots going on over time that we're measuring the patches and clear-cut areas against in our analyses. So this summer in 2024, we'll be collecting the ticks in the control area as usual. We'll be collecting ticks in the patch cut area. This year it's going to be 3 years post-harvest. And then we'll be collecting ticks in and surrounding the clear cut area 1 year post-harvest. We also will be measuring vegetation. That's a typo in the clear cut area. There's not going to be a whole lot to measure because all of the trees are getting cut. But we try to do these vegetation measurements not annually, but periodically, and especially immediately after these harvests have taken place, so we can get a feel for like what features of the overstory and the understory are driving mechanistically any changes in tick densities. Okay, that is what I've got for the slides. I see that there's a little action in the chat. I've got plenty of time remaining. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I will continue to call on Alyssa to help provide clarification on some of these points as well. So yeah, thanks for your attention.
Allie, thank you for the presentation. It was fascinating. So I want to open up the floor to any questions. I see Andrew has his hand up.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a naive question, but in terms of the buckthorn management, so it's an invasive species that then has these like kind of monoculture stands, is that right?
Yes, so the buckthorn really like takes over the whole area. Where we see the buckthorn infestations is in like slightly acidic soil, places where like white pine tends to be dominant, which is a tree that we're really concerned with in Maine because it's of a lot of economic importance. And it does really tend to become a monoculture, and it takes a while to get rid of. Like Alyssa and I were going on field site visits yesterday with our university forest manager, Q Canody, and he was telling us about how the management can be kind of like a two-phase process. Like 1 year where you're doing like brush cuts of all of the, the taller plants, and then the next season you're doing a foliar spray to knock them back. And then you need to do a little maintenance as well, because the buckthorn in particular does have a 2-year seed bank.
Okay.
So you to go back and manage over several successive years in order to keep everything down. But he showed us properties, and I've got pictures of this as well, where he's been managing for a couple years, and it's dramatic. Like this stuff dies like pretty quickly after management takes place, or at least it doesn't, regrow super fast. And so there are able to get it pretty well under control to the point that it doesn't need further management after only like 3 years or so of the cuts and the foliar sprays.
Okay, and the thinking is that the patches around the buckthorn stands will have especially high or especially low densities.
So that's the open question here. You can envision different scenarios taking place. You can envision that if you cut this area, you're creating edge that's going to be good for deer. You're creating habitat that the ticks can use, and maybe you would have higher densities surrounding the area where
shifting the whole ecologies.
Or you can imagine the opposite scenario where you wind up seeing an area-wide reduction in ticks because we've got fewer ticks in this one area. It's reducing the size of the tick population in the surrounding place. We don't know the answer to that. I have not identified any prior work that's dealt with that issue per se. And so that's one of our big questions. And we think that these are kind of practical questions that might really matter to homeowners who are thinking about whether to do management.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Did I see Steve's hand?
Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of answered my question at the tail end there. I was going to ask you to speculate, to dish a little bit on what you thought might be the plausible mechanisms for the buckthorn.
Yep. So what I'm thinking, like my line of reasoning about why buckthorn is going to increase tick densities, so it's kind of interesting. Like we see these associations between tick densities and lots of different invasive plants, but the mechanisms are very different depending on especially the relationship between those plant species and deer. And so buckthorn is interesting because deer don't browse it, but it's dense enough, not so dense that we think mice can get into it. And so what I'm thinking is the phenomenon at play here is that the deer aren't browsing the buckthorn, they're browsing the native plants nearby. And so we wind up getting like this very high humidity, really ideal habitat for the ticks underneath the buckthorn. And then at the same time, the mice have a really nice habitat underneath the buckthorn because they can get in, but their natural predators can't because it's so dense. And so I think we're going to have a lot of ticks and pathogens, one assumes, being introduced into the buckthorn infested areas because of the mice getting in there. We have deer in the surrounding area, but not immediately like around the buckthorn. And then the ticks are getting deposited in this ideal microclimate because the deer aren't browsing the buckthorn, so tick densities will go up. That's my hypothesized mechanism. It's kind of different from honeysuckle. Like honeysuckle, the deer eat like gangbusters. And so there we see like the associations between ticks and honeysuckle, but it's because the deer are around. So this is going to be different, I think, in terms of process. But that's what I'm thinking the mechanism is. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And we're planning to do some, like, obviously some other side measurements as well to try to figure out what those mechanisms might be.
The other thought about the buckthorn is, so in my lifetime, I've seen it sort of the infestations in upstate New York where I grew up, and it tends to infest the abandoned agricultural meadows.
Yeah,
it's not growing underneath hardwood stands. So I wonder if you're thinking about some of your control sites being meadows that haven't yet been, or fields that haven't yet been infested, as opposed to
it's a really good point. Yeah. And even Alyssa, correct me if you think I'm wrong about it or misrepresenting any of this, but when we were out doing the field site visits over the past week, like we did see the places that did not have a lot of overstory but did have deciduous leaf litter were getting dominated by buckthorn. And so when we're looking for our control sites, yes, I agree. You hit the nail on the head. This is going to be a very important exercise, identifying the appropriate controls. we're looking for canopies that are a little bit thinner, but do have like native vegetation as our contrast to the buckthorn. I wasn't really thinking of doing open fields because I don't think that that's going to be a good habitat for black-legged tick. And we don't want to like pit it in the other way, even though those are, the properties that are vulnerable to buckthorn infestation. But we're giving a lot of care to the identification of the controls for exactly the reason you described. I agree with you.
Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom.
I'm not sure if you are familiar, maybe Lars could fill in, but I believe Susan Paskowicz's group in the upper Midwest had a buckthorn removal thing. I don't know if you are familiar with that, and I don't know what the results of that were
I
necessarily.
am not familiar with that, but I do know Susan, and I will get in touch with her.
Yeah,
she's great. I really enjoyed my interactions with her.
Yeah.
I will ask her about that. I'm not familiar. I haven't seen the study. I don't know how recent it was, but I will. Yes, it's a very similar landscape in many ways to Maine, what you see in the upper Midwest, and so that is a really logical group for me to connect with.
And the other thought, I guess I missed what the size of the removal, the buckthorn removal.
20 by 20 meters.
So I'm just worried that your hypothesis of so it's almost the opposite of our deer fencing study, where we didn't really see any real impact, but that's just because the rodents can go in and out of that real easily, even though the buckthorn stance might preclude deer getting in. 20 meters doesn't seem like it's really enough to.
So we have self-justified this in 2 ways. First, I did an extensive lit review of all of the prior studies dealing with invasive plants and ticks, and the studies that were done with honeysuckle and Lone Star tick in the Midwest, and a lot of the studies that were done in Connecticut with barberry had plots of exactly this size. So we're proposing to do at least as consistent with what we see in the literature, and so and effects certainly have been seen at this size plot in the literature and other systems. And so I agree, it is like almost the exact reverse of what you're doing with the deer fencing. And I agree that these are not spatial units that the mice have a larger home range than these spatial units. But I think that given the expense of the management and, the difficulties inherent to finding the field sites of an appropriate size, I think that I found enough way to justify to myself, at least, that this makes sense in terms of the area. And then the other way that I'm justifying it is that we've talked to a lot of these property managers, and my colleagues who are in human dimensions of forestry have talked to a lot of property owners about what area they can often, typically afford to manage at once. And this seems like about the size for like a single management effort. Like often people will divide their properties up into like parcels, and they'll focus on managing this portion now and then this portion when more money comes around to do so. And so this seems like consistent with what people find tractable to do. And in the interest of having practical applied research, I think this will tell us something, even if what it tells us is that we need to do more management.
Anyway, good job with your presentation too, Allie.
Yeah, thanks. I see that there are things in the chat, but I'm really struggling to manage the chat and manage the computer at the same time. But we do have a few more.
I can read them to you. So Lars asks, how do you view the balance for public lands for people to use personal protection measures versus implementing tick control?
Yes.
And then in what scenario is tick control? Tick control of greatest value for public lands?
Yeah, so that is these are great questions, things that I'm interested in, things I'm sure Andrew is interested in, that I think open up like a whole separate vein of research. I think we need to get a better understanding of where people are encountering ticks in places like Maine, because again, I'm not convinced that it is exactly the same as the kind of the driving hypothesis that people are encountering ticks on their own properties in other states. So I think that we need to get a good understanding of where people are encountering ticks, and that can drive like what the best targets are for management activities. as to the balance between individual protective practices and tick control, the way that I've been thinking of this, and I'm curious on others' perspectives, I've been thinking of this as like kind of a public goods versus private goods problem. Like individual tick control is a private good. You're doing it on yourself. You're only benefiting yourself. And you have a high degree of control over it as an individual. But you can think of management like this. It's more of a public good in the sense that it could lead to an area-wide reduction in ticks, not just reducing individual tick exposure through the mechanism of preventing ticks from attaching to you, the person. There could be area-wide reductions in ticks. They are more controversial. They are more high cost. And so there are downsides as well. But this is what I've been doing on the sabbatical. I keep like coming back to this because I found it so interesting. You can imagine that there are scenarios where it's going to be more palatable to people to be engaging in these more expensive, higher risk, high reward management strategies. And there are scenarios where people are more going to want to take this into their own hands and engage just in their individual protection practices. So I think that there's an interesting research question surrounding which situations are people willing to cooperate in these larger tick control efforts, and in which situations do they really want to have it in their own hands? And then what people want and what's effective. My hypothesis is that it's very tightly linked, and the way that we see tick control and tick and efforts to prevent tick bites failing is when people are in a situation where the dominant strategy that they're having to rely on is one that they don't want to be engaging in. So I think that there's a lot of questions here. In my view, I'm so interested in this topic. I think it's a whole separate research program. It is one that I am very keen to get engaged with, along with colleagues in this group. I don't know if that answers the question.
In matter of time, we have one more question from Jennifer.
That
I guess
sounds
we'll answer that,
yeah.
and then.
Yeah. Hi, I'll make it quick. I don't know most of you, but I'm down in North Carolina, and I really appreciate your consideration of different sources and looking at different ways to solve the problem. So down here, deer are the main transporters
Yes.
of the ticks, and we call them unfondly tick factories. But there's a really interesting research that I learned about a few years ago going on in South Texas, where they were spraying nilgai and their ungulates in order to control ticks from coming across the border. But
yeah,
I don't know. I'm going to drop it in the chat box in case any of you aren't really familiar with it. But I think it's a really great yet another way to control ticks. And I don't know, in your forests are the what are they, ungulates, the deer and the moose, are they like a main source?
I feel like there are people on this call who have better expertise to answer the question than I do. I think I might look to Tom, since I see Nita's off the call now. Do you have any thoughts about this, Tom? He might be kind of in and out as well, as we're coming up on the hour. I know there has been like other work done within this group that's been more focused on wildlife related management approaches like that. Like there's been work on deer exposures and four-poster devices to apply the acaricides to deer. This isn't an area that I've worked in. I generally have been more focused on landscape management and vegetation management compared to wildlife management per se. But of course, the vegetation management does have implications for wildlife activity, and so they are very closely related, and I think they can be complementary as well. But I'm going to look at that study. Thank you for the link. I'm interested to see what they were doing here. Thank you so much for the question.
All right. Allie, again, thank you so much for the presentation. And this recording will be on the NUVEC site posted later today. So if you want to listen again, feel free to visit our site and have access to that.
That's great. Thank you. And Nolan, could I ask, is there any possibility that you could save the chat log as well for me? Because I see that there's a lot of comments that I'd like to give a little more attention to. And if I could get that log, that would be great. It usually disappears as soon as the call ends.
All right, I'll get that for you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak, everyone. And again, to Mike and Alyssa for the work is theirs.